But, we made it because we had to do a little talking amongst ourselves because of the way they treated us. And then we said, just think of our ancestors, how they made it across the water on those ships. And he said, what this thing was, the Buffalo Soldiers, they made it. So we said, well, if the Tuskegee Airmen made it, we can make it.
Could you state your name and your last retired rank?
It's Carroll W. Braxton, Master Gunnery Sergeant.
This idea of a new Negro, of African Americans being transformed by their experience in the war was incredibly powerful, incredibly evocative, and also very threatening for white America, for the federal government. But it was something that also galvanized Black protests in a number of different ways.
The Harlem Renaissance and the New Negro movement are almost not exactly the same thing, but are really related. And the New Negro movement is more political than the Harlem Renaissance, and you have writers who are outright saying, this is wrong, I'm also American, I'm entitled to democracy. But I really think the people who are impacted by that are a small group of the Black population in America. Organizations
like the NAACP, led by Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, and others, to the Universal Negro Improvement Association, led by Marcus Garvey. Other organizations that were established by veterans themselves, like the League for Democracy, for example, to even incredibly radical organizations like the African Blood Brotherhood, which would become part of the Communist Party.
Marxism, socialism, communism, Leninism, right? All of these class-based social analyses are coming out into the world, and they're influencing social movements everywhere. That's no different than in the United States.
I don't think it reaches a whole lot of people who are not in those urban centers. What does reach people, I think, is news that there are jobs and a better life in the North.
These Blacks and Black soldiers are now coming to these cities, and they are basically fed up with their oppression. They've made up in their minds that we experienced this in the South and we're not going to put up with it in the North. There's a lot of rivalries going on between these two groups, and they lead to these interracial riots that take place throughout different American cities.
In 1919, that's in Chicago, East St. Louis, and all kinds of other places. And then, of course, in 1921, this results also in the Tulsa race riot, which decimates one of the wealthiest Black communities in the United States.
A lot of these are called riots when, in fact, they were actually attacks on Black communities. What happened in Tulsa, they'll call it a race riot, when in fact it was white terrorism.
The reality that these Black families found was different from the South, for sure, but there was persistent racism. And we could see that even in the schools in the 1920s and 1930s that were segregated by race.
We get to Brown versus Board of Education, and they use social science research to show how harmful it is for Black children to be treated differently. And that was very compelling, and Earl Warren demands that this case come out as a 9-0, so that there's no question that this is the new law of the land, that segregation and separate but equal is not acceptable. And so he's able to get a 9-0 decision. However, the implementation part, he couldn't get a 9-0 decision.
They had state legislatures in the Deep South basically close public schools completely to not have to desegregate them, and then took all the tax dollars that people were paying for education and threw that money private schools, and then promised all the white parents of those kids that they could go to those private schools without paying for tuition.
There are other structural realities such as redlining that have been going on since the 30s, and that was a project sponsored by the federal government in the New Deal that color-coded neighborhoods from red to green, so that red neighborhoods were Black neighborhoods and green neighborhoods were white. And those coded maps were used by banks in making mortgage decisions.
To this day, those deep states, southern states, are the states that are the lowest in terms of the effectiveness of education in the country. They're on the bottom of that list of 50, right? And it is a straight line from them doing this in response to Brown to now. And so they were basically willing to sacrifice the quality of their kids' education and generations of white kids going forward to not have desegregation in the late 50s and into the 60s. And we are all these decades later and generations later seeing the negative impact of that on their school systems in the Deep South.
There are these structures that have segregated our housing, segregated our schools, and these things were not resolved by Brown v. Board. Brown v. Board had nothing to say about housing. And that's part of why it didn't work.
Judiciary decisions are important, but they're not everything, and they're not enforceable unless the local community is willing to enforce it. We don't directly choose our Supreme Court, we choose the people who are going to choose the Supreme Court. So because of that, it's the weakest branch of the government. Really, if you want change to happen and to last and to be enforced, you have to go through the legislature. The legislature represents the people.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
In the 30s, we have very modest benefit for returning soldiers. We also have, of course, the New Deal programs, a whole suite of programs to help America struggling. Historians recognize, though, that the benefits were distributed unequally, so that African Americans in particular were often left out.
New Deal programs, while technically applying to all Americans, a lot of the jobs were not federally administered, right? So each state was in charge of filling those positions, and FDR was notified again and again, right, that there were a lot of southern states and even a lot of northern states that were discriminating against Black workers, and knew it, was unhappy about it, but didn't engage in any policy to change it. So Black Americans are benefiting from the New Deal in the sense that they are getting access to the same kind of unemployment relief measures that white Americans are getting, but they are getting jobs in these jobs programs at a lower rate.
In the North, many Blacks were shut out of unions because unions were also run by white racists.
Philip Randolph goes to FDR and says, if you're going on and on about this arsenal for democracy, and you're going to allow discrimination against Black workers, then I'm going to call your bluff and I'm going to embarrass you, and threatens to have a 1 million man march on Washington, really with the sole purpose of embarrassing FDR on the world stage. And it doesn't happen because FDR passes the executive order setting up the Federal Employment Protection Committee and really caters to A. Philip Randolph and says, okay, like, we will set up a committee that where anyone who feels that they've been discriminated against can kick it up to the federal level and have this commission investigate. And by no means does it open the floodgate, but the percentage does go up measurably in the number of Black Americans who are able to get war work.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
We lined up, and here comes this big limo. Came up and found up with President Roosevelt. And he said, men, I have a short speech to make. And he said, you men have broken records that the Marines have set for years. And he said, as far as I'm concerned, you're just as good as any Marine that put on that uniform, sent them overseas.
From the very start, the Black press kind of vigorously debated what role African Americans should play in the war. And whether it was the Chicago Defender, the Crisis magazine edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, the New York Age, the Baltimore African American, all of these papers were venues, were spaces of debate, of commentary, but also coverage of the various events and happenings that were taking place surrounding the role of African Americans in the war.
It was altogether different overseas than back in the United States. We were there when they dropped those 2 bombs on Japan. And that's what ended the war.
W.E.B campaign suggesting that we go and fight for victory, not only abroad, but victory at home as well, rededicating ourselves to securing our victories for equality and for civil rights here.
Black community felt burned in World War I, having not gotten really any rights. So they were not enthusiastically signing up to fight in World War II, even though it was clearly another fight of freedom. African Americans certainly did enlist and were certainly fighting in World War II, but a lot of the work that they did was also to take the place of white workers who were fighting in the war.
The fact that Black women were working, even married mothers who were Black, that they were working during World War II was nothing new. The kind of novelty of Rose of the River was that these were white, middle-class, married women who were working. So it wasn't a novelty that Black women were working. It was better for them, however, because now they had access to better jobs and better wages. A lot of unions promised women that they would get paid, if not the exact same wage for the same work as men, that they would get paid close to the same wage. So women, regardless of, race, ethnicity, were making more money during the war than they did before, and than they would after. Those war wages ended when the war was over.
World War II, in many ways, it's kind of similar to World War I. Again, segregated units. I think Hollywood portrayals tend to leave this story out. So we have kind of popular World War II images where we see people coming together like a band of brothers, and that focuses on white ethnics. So you see Catholics, Protestants, and Jews who are fighting alongside one another and overcoming some of those cultural differences. But what we might not remember is that we're also dealing with segregated units.
The Marine Corps had 2 recruiting depots. One was in South Carolina and one was in San Diego, California. So they had made this special camp for Black Marines in what they call Montford Point. This was right on the swamps, and we had swamp rats and snakes that we were all around our camp where we went to boot camp. First thing they told us that we didn't want you. You don't belong in the Marine Corps because there's no Blacks in the Marine Corps, and you will never make it in the Marine Corps. But as time went on, we showed them that we could do anything they handed to us other than death.
These examples cut 2 ways. On the one hand, they inspire us. On the other hand, picking some of these best moments may have also the effect of obscuring the larger, long-term trends of negativity and racist belittling of Black contributions to the United States in all its history.
The first major act we have is Truman after World War II, desegregating the military. So the military become the first experiment of where we can sort of end all this segregation. We don't have the same kind of immediate radical behavior like we do in like 1919 in the United States, but we have this slow burn that emerges into the civil rights movement.
We were the first group to integrate the Marine Corps. And they made it as hard as they could for us. That they trained us as hard and dogged us as hard as they could to make sure that, I guess they thought a lot of us would quit. I don't remember anybody quitting or leaving camp, going over there. We stayed there and dogged it out regardless of what they did.
So many Negroes do live in substandard housing and slum housing, dilapidated housing, and it does affect the whole family.
The GI Bill is intended, right, to do a number of things, but the most important things, I think, are to provide money for education for returning veterans and to provide low-interest mortgages to returning veterans. Black returning veterans are finding that the GI Bill does not actually apply to them. And so you have these harrowing stories that we hear in interviews of Black soldiers going with their wives, their young brides, right, to look at houses and to go to the housing agent in the new suburban tract community, and the person saying, A, Black Americans aren't allowed to buy houses here, and B, if they were to try to go get a mortgage for that house, they would be turned down 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10.
GI Bill was not on its face racist or discriminatory. The benefits were open to blacks and Jews and Irish and, whichever group. But the reality on the ground made it such that white ethnics could benefit more than African Americans.
The long view of history, I think the arc is been positive. Black soldiers are responsible for modifying the attitudes of the United States somewhat, for helping ingrain the idea of black citizenship in the American public as an earned right, but less so than you might think, because again, true racism doesn't do evidence. It does not learn lessons, and good examples do not thwart the racist.
So as African Americans fought for their rights in World War I, while also simultaneously fighting on the battlefield, just as they did during World War II with the W.E.B. campaign, fighting for victory abroad against German fascism, but also fighting against racism at home. That is patriotism, fighting for what America can be, what America should be, of calling out America when it is not living up to its ideals, is arguably one of the most patriotic things that you can do.